You're surrounded by people who want something from you. Right now, in this moment, some of them know it consciously, most of them don't. But the dynamic is the same. They are measuring you, calculating what you can provide, what you'll tolerate, how far they can push before you resist. And while you were taught to see the best in people, to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions, someone else was learning to read the room, to identify who has power and who only thinks they do, to separate the players from the pawns. And that person is 3 moves ahead of you before the conversation even starts. This isn't about becoming paranoid, it's about becoming accurate. Because the world you're navigating right now is filled with people who fall into 2 categories, and your ability to distinguish between them will determine whether you build something real or spend your life getting used by people who saw you coming from a mile away. The question isn't whether people are good or bad. Morality is a story we tell ourselves to feel comfortable. The question is whether someone operates as a pawn or a player. And if you can't tell the difference within the first 5 minutes of meeting someone, you're probably the pawn in that equation. Let me be clear about what these terms mean, because this isn't about vilifying one group and celebrating the other. A pawn is someone who moves through life reactively. They respond to circumstances. They wait for permission. They operate within frameworks other people built and never question whether those frameworks serve them. A pawn doesn't make decisions. They make reactions. And reactions, no matter how well-intentioned, are predictable. And predictability is the same thing as weakness in any competitive environment. A player, on the other hand, is someone who understands that life is a series of transactions, negotiations, and positioning moves. They don't wait for the world to hand them opportunities. They create opportunities by understanding leverage, timing, and human behavior. A player doesn't need to be ruthless. They just need to be awake, aware, operating with intention instead of hope. Machiavelli spent his entire career watching princes rise and fall, and the pattern he identified wasn't about virtue in the moral sense. It was about virtù, the capacity to impose your will on chaotic circumstances. The princes who survived weren't the nicest or the most loved. They were the ones who could read a room, assess threats, identify allies and enemies, and act accordingly before anyone else saw the move coming. And the first skill in that entire chain is the ability to assess people accurately, not based on what they say, based on what they do when they think no one important is watching. Here's the first law. Pawns talk about what they're going to do. Players talk about what they've already done. This sounds simple, but watch how often it plays out in front of you. The person who spends an hour telling you about the business they're going to start, the book they're going to write, the life they're going to build, that person is performing ambition. They're not living it. They're using the conversation to feel the dopamine hit of imagining success without doing the work to create it. And if you treat that person like a player, if you invest time, energy, or resources based on their declared intentions, you will lose. Every single time. A player doesn't need to announce what they're building. They're too busy building it. And when they do talk about it, it's past tense. I launched this. I closed that deal. I handled that situation. The verb tense alone tells you everything you need to know about whether someone operates in the world or just fantasizes about it. Why does this matter? Because your time and attention are finite resources, and every minute you spend on someone who operates as a pawn is a minute you're not spending on someone who can actually move the board with you. Pawns drain, players compound. And if you can't distinguish between the two, you'll spend your entire life wondering why your circle never seems to elevate you. The second law is about responsibility. Pawns blame, players adjust. Listen to how someone talks about their failures, their setbacks, the things that didn't go the way they planned. If the story is full of external villains, bad luck, unfair circumstances, people who didn't support them the way they should have, you're listening to a pawn. Not because those things aren't real. They might be completely true. But the framing tells you everything. A pawn sees themselves as a victim of forces beyond their control. And victims, by definition, don't have agency. They're waiting for the world to change so they can finally succeed. A player, when they fail, asks a different question. Not, who did this to me, but what did I miss? They treat failure as data, as feedback, as a signal that their strategy needs adjustment. They don't waste energy on blame because blame doesn't change outcomes. Adjustment does. And the person who's constantly adjusting, constantly recalibrating based on new information is the person who eventually wins. Not because they're smarter, because they're learning faster than everyone else. How do you apply this? Listen. Just listen. In the first 10 minutes of any conversation, someone will tell you exactly who they are. They'll either take responsibility for their position in life, or they'll explain why their position is someone else's fault. And once you know which category they fall into, you know how much weight to give their words and how much distance to keep. The third law is about initiative. Pawns wait for instructions. Players create instructions. This one shows up in every context: work, relationships, social dynamics. The person who's constantly asking, what should I do? Or what do you think I should do? Is outsourcing their decision making because they don't trust their own judgment. And if they don't trust their own judgment, why would you trust it? Why would you rely on them for anything that requires independent thought or action? A player doesn't ask for permission. They assess the situation, make a decision, act on it, and adjust if needed. They might ask for input. They might seek advice. But the frame is different. They're collecting data to refine a decision they've already started making. They're not waiting for someone else to tell them it's okay to move. This is why players attract resources, and pawns don't. Resources, whether that's money, attention, opportunity, or influence, flow toward people who demonstrate the capacity to use them effectively. And effectiveness requires initiative. The person who waits to be told what to do will never be trusted with anything important. The person who acts, even imperfectly, even with mistakes, demonstrates that they can operate independently. And independence is the foundation of every power structure that's ever existed. The fourth law cuts even deeper. Pawns need validation. Players need results. Pay attention to what someone celebrates. If they're posting every small win, every minor achievement, every step forward like it's a monumental victory, they're not celebrating progress. They're farming validation. And validation-seeking behavior is one of the clearest signs that someone's sense of worth is externally determined. They need the crowd to confirm that what they're doing matters because they don't have an internal compass strong enough to navigate without constant feedback. A player doesn't need applause. They need outcomes. They might share a result when it's strategically useful, when it opens a door or establishes credibility. But they're not performing for likes. They're executing for leverage. And leverage doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about position. Why does this distinction matter? Because people who need validation are controllable. If their sense of self-worth depends on external approval, you can manipulate them just by withholding or granting that approval. They'll shift their behavior, their opinions, even their goals to maintain the flow of validation. A player who's driven by internal metrics and tangible outcomes can't be controlled that way. They're not playing for applause. They're playing for position. And position is objective. Either you have it or you don't. The fifth law ties everything together. Pawns react to the board. Players study the board. This is the meta skill that determines everything else. When something happens, a pawn's first move is emotional. They get angry, defensive, excited, whatever the stimulus triggers. And that emotional reaction clouds their judgment, makes them predictable, and opens them up to being manipulated by anyone who understands how to trigger specific responses. A player's first move is analytical. What just happened? Why did it happen? Who benefits? What are the second and third order consequences? What does this reveal about the other person's position, their strategy, their weaknesses? A player treats every interaction as information, every conflict as a diagnostic, every surprise as a chance to update their model of how the game actually works. Machiavelli was obsessed with this. The prince who couldn't detach from his emotions, who took every insult personally, who reacted instead of calculated, was the prince who got destroyed. Not because emotions are bad, because uncontrolled emotions are predictable. And predictability in a world of competing interests is the same thing as vulnerability. So here's how you apply all of this in real time. The next time you meet someone, whether it's a professional context, a social situation, or even a potential relationship, run them through these filters. Do they talk about future plans or completed actions? Do they blame circumstances or adjust strategy? Do they wait for permission or create momentum? Do they seek validation or pursue outcomes? Do they react emotionally or analyze strategically? You'll get your answer within minutes. And once you have that answer, you'll know exactly how to position yourself. If they're a pawn, you keep distance. You're polite, you're professional, but you don't invest, you don't rely on them, you don't build anything that requires their initiative or judgment. If they're a player, you pay attention. You explore alignment, you look for ways to create mutual leverage, because players recognize other players. And when two people who understand the game find each other, they can build things that pawns can't even imagine. The final piece, and this is the part most people avoid, is turning this lens on yourself. Because the uncomfortable truth is that most people reading this, most people watching this, operate as pawns in at least some areas of their life. Maybe you're a player at work, but a pawn in relationships. Maybe you're strategic with money, but reactive with your health. The categories aren't permanent, they're behavioral patterns. And patterns can be changed. The question is whether you're willing to be honest about where you're currently operating as a pawn, where you're waiting for permission, where you're blaming circumstances, where you're seeking validation instead of building results. Because the moment you identify those areas, you can start shifting. Not by pretending, by actually changing the behavior, by taking initiative, by studying instead of reacting, by becoming the kind of person other players recognize as worth engaging with. This is virtù in its purest form. Not moral virtue. effective force, the capacity to see the board clearly, to assess the players accurately, and to position yourself in a way that creates advantage rather than waiting for advantage to arrive. Fortuna, chaos, randomness will always be a factor. But the player who can read people, who can distinguish signal from noise, who can identify who's actually operating and who's just performing, that player has a level of control that pawns will never access. So here's your contract. If you understood what was just laid out, if you felt that uncomfortable recognition that maybe you've been operating as a pawn in areas you thought you had control over, then you already know what the next move is. And the beautiful part is you don't need anyone's permission to make it. You just decide, quietly, without announcement. And you start moving differently, like this video. Not because it made you feel good, because it made you see clearly. Subscribe, not for entertainment. Because you've decided to stop being the person others can predict and start being the person others have to take seriously. The players don't recruit loudly, they just recognize each other. And if you're still here, you might be closer than you think.